Pam Bondi stepped into the Miami courtroom, her steady gaze cutting through the chaos of flashing cameras and whispering crowds. The judge, Victor Hargrove, smirked down at her with unveiled contempt, his mocking words dripping with arrogance. But what happened next would turn the entire room upside down and rewrite Pam's legacy in a way no one saw coming. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting just for you. Pam Bondi walked into the Miami criminal courthouse with her head held high, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she moved toward the defense table. She was here to represent James Torres, a city official accused of siphoning millions from public funds in a sprawling corruption case that had gripped the city. The room buzzed with the low hum of anticipation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, spectators whispered among themselves, and the air crackled with the weight of expectation. This wasn't just another day in court for Pam. It was a battleground where her reputation, her client's future, and her resolve would be tested. She'd faced tough cases before, but this one carried a different edge, a sense of something bigger lurking beneath the surface. At the front of the room sat Judge Victor Hargrove, a towering figure in both stature and reputation. His sharp eyes scanned the courtroom, his presence commanding silence without effort. Hargrove was infamous in legal circles, known for his biting wit, quick rulings, and a knack for cutting down anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Pam had heard the stories, attorneys leaving his courtroom in defeat, their arguments shredded by his dismissive tongue. Today, she was stepping into his domain, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. As she set her briefcase down and adjusted her suit jacket, Hargrove's gaze landed on her, his lips curling into a faint, mocking smirk. "Well, well," he said, his voice booming across the room, "if it isn't Ms. Pam Bondi, our very own media darling, finally stepping off the TV screen to grace us with her presence in a real courtroom." The words hit like a slap, and the gallery erupted in laughter. Reporters smirked, spectators chuckled, and even some of the courtroom staff exchanged amused glances. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment, his tone dripping with condescension. "I hope you've brought more than sound bites today, Ms. Bondi. This isn't a press conference." The laughter grew louder, a wave of humiliation crashing over Pam's carefully composed exterior. She felt the sting, the implication that she was nothing more than a publicity stunt in a suit. Her past as a high-profile prosecutor had made her a household name, but here, in Hargrove's court, it was being weaponized against her. To them, she was a media star, not a serious attorney. Beside her, James Torres shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. He was a man in his late 40s, his face pale and drawn from weeks of scrutiny and stress. The accusations against him, embezzling funds meant for public projects, had turned his life upside down. "Pam," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with desperation, "you've got to win this. If you don't, I'm done. My family's done. Everything's gone." His eyes darted toward Hargrove, then back to her, pleading for reassurance. Pam gave him a curt nod, her expression steady despite the chaos around her. She could feel his panic radiating, a heavy weight pressing against her own resolve. Torres wasn't just a client. He was a man teetering on the edge, and she was his last line of defense. Inside, Pam's mind churned. Hargrove's mockery wasn't new. She'd faced egos like his before, judges and lawyers who thought they could intimidate her into submission. But this felt personal, a deliberate attempt to undermine her before she even opened her mouth. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a slow, burning determination that ignited deep within her. She wasn't here to play their game or bow to their ridicule. She was here to fight, to prove that her presence in this courtroom wasn't a fluke or a publicity grab. Every snicker from the gallery, every smug glance from Hargrove only fueled her resolve. She'd been underestimated before, dismissed as a figurehead rather than a force, and she'd turned those moments into victories. This would be no different. Pam straightened her posture, her eyes locking onto Hargrove's. She wouldn't let his words shake her. "Court is now in session," the bailiff called, his voice cutting through the lingering chuckles. The room settled, but the tension remained, thick and electric. Hargrove leaned forward slightly, his smirk still in place, as if daring her to falter. Pam took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her legal pad. She wasn't rattled. Not yet. If anything, his arrogance sharpened her focus. This wasn't about theatrics or ego. It was about the truth, and she was damn well going to make them see it. Hargrove might think he had the upper hand, but Pam Bondi had never backed down from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and Judge Victor Hargrove's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Let's get this started, Miss Bondi," he said, his tone laced with impatience. "I trust you've got something worth hearing, or are we just here for a rerun of your TV highlights?" The gallery snickered again, a ripple of amusement spreading through the spectators. Pam stood up, her posture rigid, her face a mask of calm determination. She knew Hargrove was setting the stage, painting her as an outsider before she could even begin. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to present the facts of this case, nothing more, nothing less." But before she could continue, Ethan Caldwell, the opposing counsel, shot to his feet, his slick suit and smug grin practically screaming confidence. "Objection, Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice smooth but sharp. "Miss Bondi's already wasting time with theatrics. We all know her client's guilty. Let's not drag this out with pointless grandstanding." Hargrove raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Sustained," he said, his eyes flicking back to Pam. "You've got 10 minutes, Miss Bondi. Make it quick. I've got a full docket, and I'm not in the mood for a circus. 10 minutes. The words hit Pam like a punch to the gut. A corruption case this complex? Millions of dollars, forged documents, and a web of accusations, boiled down to a measly 10 minutes? It was absurd, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Hargrove's bias was clear. He'd already tipped his hand toward Caldwell, and now he was tightening the screws to make her squirm. Pam squared her shoulders and began. "Your Honor, my client, James Torres, has been falsely accused of embezzling public funds. The evidence will show that Pinnacle Construction, the plaintiff in this case, manipulated records to frame him." Her words were precise, her tone measured, but she hadn't gotten 2 sentences in before Hargrove interrupted again. "Manipulated records?" he scoffed, leaning forward. "That's a bold claim, Ms. Bondi. I hope you've got more than accusations to back it up, because I've heard this song and dance before." The gallery chuckled, and Caldwell jumped in, his voice dripping with mockery. "She doesn't, Your Honor. This is just a desperate attempt to dodge the obvious. Torres signed off on every dime that went missing." The room seemed to close in around Pam, the weight of their words pressing against her resolve. She glanced at James Torres, who was staring at her with wide, frantic eyes. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, his voice trembling with panic. "They're tearing us apart already. You said you could handle this." His desperation was palpable, a raw edge of fear that sliced through Pam's focus. She turned to him briefly, her expression firm but calm. "Trust me, James. I've got this." But his hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, his faith in her visibly crumbling. "You'd better," he muttered, his tone sharp with doubt. "I didn't hire you to crash and burn in 10 minutes. The pressure wasn't just coming from the bench or her client, it was internal too." Sarah Klein, her assistant, leaned in close, her voice a tense whisper. "Pam, this isn't working. Hargrove's already made up his mind and you're just digging us deeper. Maybe we should pivot, offer a plea deal before it's too late." Pam's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she turned to Sarah. "A plea deal?" she snapped quietly, keeping her voice low so the gallery wouldn't hear. "James is innocent, Sarah. We're not folding because Hargrove wants to play king of the courtroom." Sarah frowned, her frustration bubbling up. "Innocent or not, you're losing them. Look at Caldwell. He's eating this up." "You're too stubborn, Pam. This strategy's gonna tank us." Pam felt the sting of Sarah's words, the crack in their usually solid partnership adding another layer of tension. She trusted Sarah's instincts. Her assistant had a sharp mind and a knack for reading the room, but this wasn't the time to back down. "I don't care what it looks like," Pam replied, her voice low and fierce. "I'm not here to play it safe. I'm here to win." Sarah shook her head, crossing her arms, her dissent hanging between them like a storm cloud. The rift was small but real, and it gnawed at Pam's focus as she turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," Pam pressed on, raising her voice slightly to reclaim the room's attention. "Pinnacle Construction falsified financial reports to shift blame onto my client. If you'll allow me to present the evidence—" Hargrove cut her off again, his tone sharp. "Evidence? "You're still on that, Miss Bondi? I've seen nothing but hot air so far." "Maybe Caldwell's right. This is a waste of time." The gallery laughed again, louder this time, and Caldwell leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a triumphant smirk. "She's got nothing, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying a taunting lilt. "Torres is guilty, and she knows it. This is just a sad little performance." The mockery was relentless, a barrage from every angle. Pam's fingers tightened around her pen, her knuckles whitening as she fought to keep her composure. She could feel the room slipping away, the judge's bias, Caldwell's arrogance, the gallery's amusement. It was a tidal wave threatening to drown her case before it even began. James Torres's voice broke through again, sharper now, almost pleading. "Pam, do something! They're laughing at us, at me. I can't go down like this." His desperation was a knife twisting in her side, but she refused to let it show. "Stay calm," she told him, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm not done yet." She took a breath, forcing herself to block out the noise, the laughter, the doubts, the tension with Sarah. She had to focus. Hargrove might have given her 10 minutes, but she'd make every second count. "Your Honor," she said again, her voice rising with a commanding edge, "the facts don't lie. Pinnacle Construction's own records contradict their claims, and I can prove it." Hargrove rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Prove it," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You've got 8 minutes left, Miss Bondi. I'd suggest you stop talking and start showing, 'cause I'm not buying what you're selling." Caldwell seized the moment, standing again with a flourish. "She can't prove anything, Your Honor. This is a fairy tale from a washed-up prosecutor who's out of her depth." The gallery erupted once more, the laughter echoing off the walls. Pam's blood simmered, her mind racing as she flipped through her notes. She wasn't rattled. Not yet. But the clock was ticking, and the odds were stacking higher against her. James Torres' eyes bored into her, his panic a tangible weight. "Pam, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're my only shot." Sarah's silence beside her was deafening, her disapproval a quiet rebuke. Pam ignored it all, her gaze locking onto Hargrove's. She wasn't here to lose. She wasn't here to be laughed at. She was here to fight, and she'd be damned if she let them bury her in 10 minutes. The room was a pressure cooker now, every word a spark threatening to ignite the tension. Pam knew she was on the ropes. Hargrove's favoritism toward Caldwell was blatant. James' trust was fraying, and Sarah's dissent was a thorn in her side. But she'd been in worse spots before, and she'd clawed her way out. She adjusted her stance, her mind sharpening as she prepared her next move. The gallery might see this as a circus, but to Pam, it was a war, and she wasn't about to surrender, not to Hargrove, not to Caldwell, not to anyone. She had 8 minutes left, and she'd make them regret ever underestimating her. Pam Bondi stood at the defense table, her heart pounding but her hands steady as she reached into her briefcase. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension, and the echoes of laughter still lingering from Ethan Caldwell's latest jab. Judge Victor Hargrove loomed over the proceedings, his impatience palpable, his bias toward Caldwell as clear as day. She'd been given 10 minutes, 8 remained, and the weight of James Torres's desperation, Sarah Klein's doubt, and the gallery's mockery bore down on her like a storm. But Pam wasn't crumbling. She'd been backed into corners before, and she'd always found a way to punch through. Now, with the clock ticking, she pulled out her ace, a small digital recorder, its sleek surface glinting faintly under the courtroom lights. "Your Honor," Pam said, her voice cutting through the residual snickers with a calm authority that demanded attention, "I have evidence that will turn this case on its head. This is a recording, obtained legally, that proves Ethan Caldwell and Pinnacle Construction conspired to frame my client, James Torres." She held the device up, her eyes locked on Hargrove's, daring him to dismiss her now. The room went still for a heartbeat, the sudden silence almost deafening after the chaos of the past few minutes. Then, as if a dam had broken, the gallery erupted, gasps, murmurs, and a few sharp exclamations rippling through the crowd. Caldwell shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous," he shouted, slamming a hand on his table. "She's fabricating evidence to save her sinking ship." Hargrove's gavel crashed down, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. "Order!" he bellowed, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Pam. Ms. Bondi, you better have a damn good explanation for this, because if you're wasting my time, or worse, attempting to mislead this court, I'll have you sanctioned faster than you can blink." His voice was a low growl, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Pam didn't flinch. She'd expected this reaction. Hargrove's temper was legendary, and she'd just thrown a Molotov cocktail into his carefully controlled domain. "Your Honor," she replied, her tone unwavering, "this recording isn't a fabrication. It's the truth. And it shows that Caldwell and Pinnacle acted in bad faith, manipulating my client into a position where he'd take the fall." She pressed on, her voice rising slightly to carry over the growing unrest in the room. "Under the doctrine of equitable estoppel, the law protects those who've been misled by another party's deceit. Pinnacle fed James Torres false information to secure his signature on those contracts, knowing full well they'd pin the blame on him when the funds went missing. This recording proves it." She clicked the play button before Hargrove could interrupt again, and the room filled with the crackle of static, followed by Caldwell's voice, smooth, confident, and damning. "Torres won't see it coming," he said, his words chillingly clear. "We've got the paperwork locked down. Hargrove will side with us. He always does when the evidence looks this tight." A second voice, gruff and unfamiliar, chimed in. "Good. Let 'em fry, we're clean." The courtroom exploded. Spectators shouted over each other, some crying foul, others demanding justice. Caldwell's face went from red to pale in an instant, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water before he found his voice. "That's a fake," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Pam. "She's doctored it. This is slander, libel, whatever you call it in court. I demand it be stricken from the record." He turned to Hargrove, his eyes wild with panic. "Your Honor, you can't let her get away with this. She's desperate. She's lying." The gallery split down the middle, half jeering at Pam, calling her a fraud, the other half murmuring in stunned support, their faith in the prosecution's case shaken. Hargrove slammed his gavel again, harder this time, the wood groaning under the force. "Enough," he snapped, his face a mask of fury. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Pam's. "Miss Bondi, you've got some nerve pulling a stunt like this. If that recording isn't authentic, if you've even hinted at falsifying evidence, I'll bury you in contempt charges so deep you'll never practice law again. Do you understand me?" His threat hung heavy, a guillotine blade poised above her career. Pam met his gaze, her pulse racing, but her resolve ironclad. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," she said, her voice cool and measured. "But I'm not bluffing. That recording is real, and I can produce the metadata to prove it, time-stamped, unedited, and legally obtained from a whistleblower at Pinnacle. You want the truth? It's right here." The room held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. James Torres grabbed her arm, his grip tight with desperation. "Pam, what the hell are you doing?" he whispered fiercely. "If this backfires, I'm toast." She shook him off gently, her focus unwavering. "It won't," she said, her voice low but firm. "Trust me." Sarah Klein, still seated beside her, muttered under her breath, "This is insane. You're gambling everything." Pam ignored her, her attention fixed on Hargrove. She knew the stakes. Her reputation, her client's freedom, her entire case hung on this moment. But she also knew she was right, and she wasn't about to let Caldwell's bluster or Hargrove's wrath stop her. The judge's eyes flickered, a storm of conflicting emotions brewing behind them. Anger, skepticism, and something else, something that looked almost like curiosity. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice quieter now but no less menacing. "If you want me to take this seriously, you'd better convince me. Right now." Pam nodded, stepping forward with the recorder still in hand. "Then listen to it again, Your Honor," she said, her tone unyielding. "Hear it for yourself. Every word. And tell me if that sounds like an innocent man or a conspiracy you've been blind to." She hit play once more, and Caldwell's voice filled the room again, each syllable a nail in his own coffin. The gallery fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Hargrove's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on the bench as he listened. Caldwell lunged forward, his voice cracking with panic. "Turn it off! This is a setup! She's framing me!" But his protest sounded hollow now, drowned out by the undeniable clarity of the recording. Pam stood tall, her eyes never leaving Hargrove's. She could feel the shift, the tide turning, however slightly, in her favor. The gallery's jeers faded into a mix of shock and uncertainty, some spectators leaning forward, others whispering furiously to their neighbors. Hargrove raised a hand, silencing Caldwell mid-rant. "Sit down," he barked, his gaze still locked on Pam. The room obeyed, the chaos subsiding into an uneasy hush. He leaned back, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. For the first time since Pam had walked in, he didn't interrupt, didn't mock, didn't dismiss. He just listened as the recording looped to its end. The final words, "Let him fry," hanging in the air like a death knell. Pam felt the pressure bearing down on her, the eyes of every person in the room, James, Sarah, Caldwell, the gallery, burning into her. She'd thrown everything into this gamble, and now it was Hargrove's move. Minutes stretched into eternity as he sat there, his silence louder than any outburst. Pam's mind raced, but her face remained a mask of composure. She'd forced his hand, made him confront the possibility that he'd been wrong, that Caldwell's smug certainty was a house of cards. The gallery was split, their reactions a chaotic symphony of support and skepticism. But Pam didn't care about them. This was between her and Hargrove now. Had she pushed too far, or had she finally cracked his armor? His next words would decide everything, and she stood ready, her breath steady, her resolve unshaken. She'd given him the truth. Now it was up to him to face it. The silence in the Miami criminal courthouse stretched taut as a wire, every eye fixed on Judge Victor Hargrove. His gavel rested untouched on the bench, his fingers still steepled as he stared down at Pam Bondi. The recording's final words, "Let him fry," still echoed in the room. A damning indictment that had silenced Ethan Caldwell's protests and split the gallery into a tangle of whispers and stunned stare. Pam stood firm, her breath steady despite the storm raging inside her. She'd laid everything on the line, her evidence, her reputation, her client's fate. And now it was Hargrove's call. James Torres gripped her arm, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What's he going to do, Pam? Did we win?" She didn't answer, her gaze locked on the judge. She couldn't predict his next move, but she knew she'd shaken him. Hargrove leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Miss Bondi," he began, his tone stripped of its earlier mockery, "I've listened to your recording, and I'll concede. It's compelling. The suggestion of bad faith by Pinnacle Construction and Mr. Caldwell can't be ignored." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of surprise and grudging respect. Pam's heart leapt, a flicker of triumph sparking within her, but Hargrove wasn't finished. He raised a hand, silencing the room. "However," he continued, his eyes narrowing, "this evidence raises questions that go beyond what's before me today. It's not just about Torres's guilt or innocence. It hints at a broader conspiracy, one that implicates both sides of this case." The words hung heavy, and Pam's mind raced to process them. Before she could respond, Hargrove delivered his ruling. "I'm suspending this trial," he said, his voice firm and final. "I'm ordering an immediate investigation into Pinnacle Construction, Mr. Caldwell, and yes, Mr. Torres as well. There's too much smoke here for me to rule definitively without knowing where the fire's coming from." Court adjourned. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack, and the room erupted into chaos. Then Caldwell bolted upright, his face a mask of panic. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice cracking as he turned to Hargrove. "You can't do this. That recording's a lie. She's set me up. I demand a mistrial." His hands shook as he rifled through his papers, his earlier smugness replaced by raw desperation. The gallery buzzed with conflicting reactions. Some spectators jeered at Caldwell, others muttered about Pam's trickery, while a few reporters scrambled to their feet, already typing headlines on their phones. James Torres turned to Pam, his eyes blazing with fury. "Suspended?" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "What the hell does that mean? I hired you to get me off, not to leave me hanging. You've ruined me." Pam pulled her arm free from his grip, her expression calm but her mind whirling. "James, listen to me," she said, her tone low and steady. "This isn't over. Hargrove's investigation could clear you completely. It's a chance we didn't have 10 minutes ago." But Torres wasn't hearing it. "A chance?" he snapped, his face red with anger. "I needed a win, Pam, not some damn maybe. You said you'd handle this." He stormed off to the side, muttering curses under his breath, his trust in her shattered. Sarah Klein, still seated, shot Pam a look, half relief, half exasperation. "You dodged a bullet," she said quietly. "But this isn't what we planned." Pam didn't respond immediately. She stood there, the chaos swirling around her. Caldwell's frantic objections, Torres's outbursts, the gallery's divided clamor. But a slow realization was dawning. Hargrove hadn't given her the clean victory she'd aimed for, but he'd done something else. He'd validated her evidence, cracked open the case, and turned the tables on Caldwell. She hadn't won the battle outright, but she'd shifted the war in her favor. The judge's ruling wasn't a defeat, it was an opportunity, a door she could push wide open. She straightened her posture, her lips curving into a faint, determined smile. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Weeks later, the fallout proved her right. The investigation Hargrove ordered dug deep into Pinnacle Construction's records, unearthing a web of forged documents, backroom deals, and incriminating emails that pinned the corruption squarely on Caldwell and his clients. Whistleblowers came forward, corroborating Pam's recording with testimony that exposed Pinnacle's scheme to scapegoat Torres. The press ran wild with the story of Miami corruption scandal blows wide open, and Pam's name was everywhere, not as a media star, but as the attorney who'd cracked the case when no one else could. Torres wasn't exonerated immediately, the investigation was ongoing, but the evidence piling up against Pinnacle made his innocence increasingly clear. Caldwell, meanwhile, faced disbarment proceedings, his career imploding under the weight of his own lies. Pam sat in her office one evening, the Miami skyline a faint glow beyond her window, a stack of news clippings on her desk. The headlines praised her tenacity, her brilliance, her refusal to back down. She hadn't won in the courtroom that day, not in the traditional sense, but she'd won something bigger. Hargrove's unexpected twist had handed her a victory she couldn't have scripted, a chance to dismantle the conspiracy from the ground up, to clear her client's name, and to cement her reputation as a force no one could dismiss. Torres had called her earlier, his tone softer, almost apologetic. "I didn't see it then," he'd said, "but you were right. This might actually save me." She'd smiled into the phone, her voice steady. "I told you to trust me." Sarah walked in, a coffee cup in hand, and dropped into a chair across from Pam. "You pulled it off," she said, a wry grin tugging at her lips. "I thought we were done when Hargrove suspended the case, but you turned it into a win. How'd you know?" Pam leaned back, her eyes glinting with quiet confidence. "I didn't," she admitted, "but I knew the truth would come out eventually. Hargrove gave me the opening. I just had to wait for it to play out." Sarah shook her head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You're something else, Pam." The victory wasn't the clean courtroom triumph Pam had envisioned when she'd walked into that trial. There'd been no immediate exoneration, no dramatic gavel strike declaring Torres free, but it was better. Messier, slower, but undeniable. She'd taken Hargrove's curveball and turned it into a knockout punch, exposing Caldwell's deceit and elevating her own standing in a way no one could have predicted. The gallery's laughter, Caldwell's arrogance, Torres's doubt, all of it had faded into the background as the real story emerged. Pam Bondi wasn't just a lawyer who'd survived a tough judge. She was the one who'd outsmarted the system, flipped the script, and come out on top. As she sipped her coffee, Pam glanced at the recorder still sitting on her desk, a silent testament to the gamble that had paid off. She hadn't just won a case, she'd redefined the fight, and the next time she stepped into Hargrove's courtroom, or any courtroom, no one would dare call her a media star again. They'd call her what she was: unstoppable.